Hello and welcome to NIGP's Learning Lab. I'm Lisa Frank. Today's session is Use Just Enough Structure, Communicate, Plan, Follow Up, hosted by Richard Pennington with special guests, Dr. Dan Price and David Gragan. Richard has over 35 years of experience in public procurement law and leadership in the U.S. Air Force and state government, 7 years of which was in private law practice. He helps development and facilitation of NIGP's Pathways courses. Richard is co-author of the 3rd edition of Legal Aspects of Public Procurement and author of Seeing Excellence, Learning from Great Procurement Teams. So Richard, let's get started.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I mean, we're going to have a nice small group. We're going to have 2 breakouts so you all can share some experiences today. I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Dan Price, who I'll introduce here in a second. So here's my question, my quick poll. How many of you manage projects? Raise your hands. And you can wave too, or you can just wave, or how many of you? I see 3, I see 4. I see a thumbs up by Diane. Cool. Okay, well, that was a trick question because you know what? You all manage projects, right? I mean, especially this profession, you all manage projects. And even if you're not a procurement professional, you do anyway. I mean, I try to cook. That's a big project management process. So what we're going to do today is fill in some of the blanks on project management. And for you and some of you have been on here before already for some of the prior labs, you know that a lot of this started in the 2002 was when I became division director of finance and procurement in Colorado, and we were searching around for a continuous improvement model. I had looked in our independent bookstore here and saw a lot about Six Sigma, which was pretty much Greek to me, frankly, and we kind of came up with our own. We called it Scope, Sustain, Controls Oversight, and Policy Evaluation, because we had some customer satisfaction, customer relationship challenges. There were some people that really hated us and what we were doing in oversight. So we dove into a continuous improvement project and came up with the idea of scope, and use scopes, which are instruments for viewing, as sort of our visual mnemonics. That's the word I would often use, visual mnemonics, for the steps in continuous improvement, the essential disciplines of teams. And this is one of them. This was the one described in chapter 5. And the image we used, and actually this is where it all started for us. I remember a conference call or a conference room meeting when we actually had those, and somebody said, "What's on your radar?" And don't think it was me. It might have been because I had an aviation background, but we started talking about that, and at some point somebody said, "Well, what about scopes is kind of a cool thing, gyroscopes and those sorts of things, the ways to remind you of the elements of problem solving." And eventually those moved into framing the book. And but this is one of the images that came right out of one of our radar scopes that we published online in our department, so people could see what we were working on, like contract management improvements and sort of risk-based oversight monitoring and procurement in all of our functions. And we also raised the small purchase limits in a series of things. So this worked. Get you started on an agenda for stakeholder meeting and procurement planning. We're going to use an e-procurement system, real short scenario to get you to start that. We're going to talk about working backward from the objective and creating scheduled dependencies and finding those or assessing those and figuring out what needs to be done first, like long lead items and things. We'll begin the process of developing that checklist and procurement planning. I'm going to show you some slides that I've used over the years that really illustrate, if you don't know this already, how much of what you do is really a project. We're going to talk about something called the triple constraints. I learned from Dan about the triple constraints. He's the project management professional, and It's a great little tool, something to keep in mind. And at some point, I'd like you to think about how you spot when you've got too much structure, when so much structure starts, getting in the way of, of creativity or innovation. So let's talk about Dan a little bit. Dan told me he was going to punish me and wears Aloha shirt, which he did. I, on the other hand, am in Colorado where we have snow on the ground. Dan was in Colorado Springs for some time. That's where we actually met. He's a grad, but a younger grad than me from the Air Force Academy. He's principal of Winning Ways Management. He has moved into leadership coaching, teaches leadership now for the University Online. He is a PMP. He wrote a great little book called Takeoff, which builds on his aviation experience. Resonated with me. It really helped me figure out where things we used to say when we flew, like stay ahead of the airplane, fit into this whole thing. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes when we have the conversation with Dan. He is a retired Air Force officer. And welcome, Dan. I'll just pop this off real fast and let you wave to everybody with that great shirt that you have. So, hey, so shaka shaka, there you go. So he's living on Oahu now and kind of living a dream as near as I can tell. So welcome.
Thank you.
Some years ago, when I was in private practice at a law firm, we used to have an event every year. I was brought into a law firm after I left the state of Colorado, primarily because I had state and local procurement experience. I had, been born in the federal procurement system, but really, to be honest with you, found state and local procurement more challenging, opportunity for more innovation. And we used to every year as a promotional event, bring our clients in, and it was usually in November, kind of not picked real great because that was snow time here, but it was when kids were in school and people could dedicate time. We'd have about 100, and this was the team that was with me. I'm cheating a little on the age here because of the length of the picture, but in the front left was Lisa King. She was a master planner. She could do an event that was well put together, and I'm going to just show you some insight. The other two, David and Carol on the slide here, were our IT support. They helped us put together the books that we used in some of our events. David was the one that helped risk manage in terms of the IT stuff that needed to happen when we went to the hotel, because we needed rooms that had about 100 people. Our E-Day, our event day, was kind of what Lisa planned back from. And at about 4 months out, she would get us together. We would come up with a theme, some possible keynote speakers and panelists, and start the process of contacting them. At about 60 days out, they would firm up the speakers and the panelists, many of which were from our firm. We would draft a flyer for distribution to the clients. And then about 30 days out, we'd send it. We'd set up a working lunch with the speakers, conference in somebody who out of town. We often had District of Columbia or DC people also that would come in. And then about 3 days prior, we had to do the breakfast count for the hotel, firm up those things. And then we had a walkthrough about a day out. We'd go to the facility, which is downtown Denver, not far from where our firm was. We'd talk about weather forecasts, come up with a plan, what would happen if we got weather on the East Coast, somebody couldn't fly in. Dave would help set up alternatives for getting in a virtual delivery. We did that even then, even though it was harder. We didn't have Zoom. And what we would do if we really had a catastrophic snow event, meaning, we just couldn't move, and of course we'd have to cancel. So this is an example of planning back from the event. Now it's kind of funny. We have on this, fortunately, Shannon Lockwood, and we'll hear from her in a few minutes also about her perspective. Shannon is, she is the grandmother, or not grandmother, I got to come up with the right word for this. She is the master planner for NIGP. I asked Shannon not to snicker, so we could hear her when I talked about our planning on our event, but she knows as well as Dan, you're going to hear from, and that I've learned, that one of the things that you really need to do is cement purpose. And the gyroscope was our sort of visual metaphor for the importance of keeping purpose in mind, what you're trying to achieve, to guide all of your project management steps, who you brought in, who was on the team, what the steps were, the things that needed to be done. And if it's not done well, a gyroscope processes and eventually it falls off. I mean, it fails. So you got to keep the motivation going. And I watched Shannon do this, for example, on the events, and she was so good at keeping touch points with everybody, making sure we were all on this huge project moving forward. Same thing on our event with McKenna. And this is the what we learned from this. Work backwards from the objective when you're planning. And we'll get some more insight into that in terms of how the volatility today in today's environment, what we're going through, affects all of that. If I were to ask you, probably rhetorically, how many times have you ever planned for an event and never had to adapt it? Now, Shannon told me it happens all the time. They never adapt, right? I mean, she told me, right, Shannon? I see some body language there that is, I see some head shaking. You're always changing these things. So, but planning helps you get in touch with the things you need to think about to make adjustments as it goes forward. So a project probably isn't in events planning. Many of you do events planning, I'm sure, for training and things you do in your own offices. But real, big projects that you do in procurement often look like this. You're a project manager. You're sitting there, you've got contractors on one side, a project team like an evaluation team that you're trying to bring into this, maybe a procurement planning team. You've got bosses watching all this go on. And then you're operating in a realm of government rules of regulations, all of this like the poor, sad person in the middle who is just shrugging his shoulders, is thinking, but nicely, we have enterprising, trained, creative, talented procurement professionals that solve all this and occupy the project management piece of this, so that they use these tools we're going to just talk about today. This is what I have commonly used in the past in terms of my overarching model in terms of planning. Getting together as a team, especially on complex projects, could be as small as 2 people if it's a requisition. What are you trying to achieve? I mean, in terms of this, if you've got other people who are going to be involved, like evaluators, procurement planning is a part of this. Solicitation and award of the contract then is a project all of itself. And then eventually, and we may hear Dan tell us this when we speak, sometimes the contract maps out the project itself. You may not have a separate charter for the contract administration. You may have one for the early parts of a team, but the contract often is going to be the charter. And then you go into performance and contract management. So what I'd like to do now is go into a breakout now. And so we're going to just practice the breakout. I'm going to put something up on here. This is going to be the activity. I'll let you read through it a little bit, and I'll summarize it. I'll talk while you're reading, and it's going to be essentially an e-procurement system. You've got a school year beginning September 1st next year. The district wants an e-catalog system, something to put in supplies and services that are commonly bought. You've had a big growth of explosion in the district, and in terms of size. And while the plan is to use face-to-face teaching in classrooms, there's a little uncertainty now about whether remote teaching or hybrid class deliveries or some combination are going to be used. So this new system is going to have e-catalog functionality to go into some of those cooperatives or state contracts or the other things at your disposal to put in the kinds of things that are going to be needed in the classrooms to make this easier, not only on you as a procurement professional, but by the teachers in the classroom. You've got an average publication time of 120 days, and the deans have been openly touting this. The pressure's on in terms of this. And so who are your stakeholders? I think we got everybody back here. So just coming out the backside, and just curious, the instruction was find somebody who's willing to talk about maybe a thought. Anybody want to, your spokesperson want to volunteer? Curious.
I thought it was good conversation. Really, the term I used was, when you're looking at who your stakeholders are, it's your up, down, and side to side, anybody that it could impact. And then one of the things we talked about was even when you identify the stakeholder group, within that group, you've got to make sure you've got an SME that can support your project, a resource that knows what they're doing. Because if they don't, you've got to make sure you find one. So don't make the assumption, okay, technology needs to be involved. They'll have somebody, we'll just get somebody scheduled on a meeting and they'll tell us who it is, and wait 2 or 3 weeks till that time to say, okay, now we need you to engage, just for them to say, we don't have anybody with this background. Or in my case with the project management, we've got to look at capacity. Can that person, even if there is a person, are they even available for the project? Do they have the capacity to take it on? So there's a lot of deeper conversations, even when you identify your stakeholders, how you identify the resources out of the stakeholders that are going to be on the team.
Great. I mean, great insight, Diane. Great. Dan, our project management professional, you trained in this stuff and now morphed into leadership. Any particular aha moment for you in terms of the discussion or comments on what you've heard?
No, actually, I thought it was really good, a good discussion, and several good points that I'll talk about in terms of stakeholders. But I thought it was a real good discussion, and it was wide ranging, which you have to do early on with the project. So I thought it was really quite a good discussion for such a limited time and number of people.
Yeah, thanks. And we are going to talk, kind of recount some of our discussion as in our conversation here in a few minutes. How about David? How about any surprises, reaffirmations, anything? Or?
Yeah, everything was a reaffirmation, really. No surprises. It's one of those things where we could have spent 2 hours and probably would have arrived more or less at the same conclusion, just in a lot further detail. But I think that alone is a pretty good learning experience. That the gross targeting at the very beginning of a project is going to probably sustain you in large part.
Yeah, and everybody, David was a senior procurement executive for the federal government in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, now is the Chief Learning Officer for District of Columbia, and was Chief Procurement Officer of 2 states before that. So he's got deep experience, and happy to have him sit in. Thanks, Dave. These are checklists that I've used over time in prior briefings to talk about the scope of solicitation planning. Some of that's touched in the materials in chapter 5 of the book and in the Word document that I gave you. Followed by the solicitation, its own project, and the steps that need to happen in that. And I'm a big proponent of the use of checklists. I think you're going to hear this again this afternoon in terms of the importance of this and of using these kinds of checklists to sort of frame who probably needs to be at the table as a stakeholder, and starting from the objective and then moving back. David's going to have to leave us, and he's busy. I appreciate it, David, and we'll talk offline a little bit about the conversation a little bit more. We're about ready to move into that. So, but I'm going to just summarize the stakeholder pieces. You've got to figure out who they are, and some of them are customers, some of them are going to be project sponsors, especially executives, people like David, for example, that might have been a senior executive. Their requirements and their interests. We talk about where the resistance is going to come from. I know Group 2 had a little discussion about, maybe teachers are going to be a little nervous, or how about users that are accustomed to certain ways of ordering already online, and they're wondering, are you going to be in our way now? I mean, what are their information needs? We'll hit that a little bit more in terms of the things that you need to keep people, and I love the term above, to the side, and below. I mean, keeping people appraised of information needs and their role in decisions. Obviously, on an e-procurement system, the decision about go or no go is a huge one, and often not going to be made as by you as the procurement officer, even if you're leading the project, it's going to be made by somebody else, a stakeholder. I wanted to do a
Richard?
shout out. Go ahead.
It's Diane. I just want to jump in on this
Yeah.
in here, because you mentioned checklists. We use a lot of checklists to make sure we're hitting all the highlights. But when you talk about bringing in the sponsor, we start in the very beginning with the charter and communication plan that they sign off on. So we have an in-depth conversation at this stage as far as what are their information needs, and our committees are broken out. We've got the sponsor, which is our governance committee. We've got a steering committee. We've got the project team, all the way down, and identify at this point all of those roles. Because without doing that, you are bound to run into a lot of problems, even just trying to develop your statement of objectives or your statement of work going forward.
Yeah,
So
and that's great insight.
we do that
Actually,
really early on in the process.
Dan is going to talk about that a little bit. And one of the reasons I put the gyroscope up early is in many cases, especially a complex project, that's one of the first things you need to do, to frame that out for everybody so they understand. We didn't make this series mandatory for everyone. We actually talked about project charters in week one, in the first one, and because it is central. So thanks for the insight on that, Diane. You're absolutely right. I want to do a shout out to Lisa. Lisa leads the Global Practice Development group in NIGP. They just published within the last week one on stakeholder relationships. Get your hands on that. That's on the NIGP website. I was a part of Lisa's work group. We had some great dialogue about not just the need for cultivating the relationships, but ways to do that and what the value is to that, and some approaches. So Lisa, you're gonna, I think, look at that. She's way ahead of me. So there's the link in the chat in terms of going and finding that. I really suggest you take a look. I talked about stakeholders in the book, but not nearly with as much insight as that practice has done. It's a terrific resource. So we're going to talk now about to Dan. Dan, this is the book cover to Dan's book. He was an aviator like me. He knows what a gyroscope, the importance of that. We learned to fly in the analog times of flight training when we needed gyros in the airplane. They still do, although the technology's changed. In order to fly, they need them to fly at night. So Dan and I had spoken before this and framed out some conversations, one of which was actually about charters. So you ready, Dan? Let's talk about this. We'll have some time at the end of this for you to ask Dan questions about his journey a little bit, and as a project manager and some of the things he's learned. I am going to turn this off so they can see you. Don't need to share just yet. So let's start with them looking at you. So I took the ideas from your book, actually, Dan, out of the chapter 5 in Foreseeing Excellence. And so, as we're going to learn a little later, the Project Management Institute has a very detailed project management body of knowledge that has, I think it's 11 or 12 knowledge areas. It's a body of knowledge similar to what procurement professionals have for their certifications. Given that is out there and there's so much training in project management, why did you write Takeoff?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for inviting me in, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Basically, what I wanted to do with that book was to write a book that was less academic and more practical. Like all of us, we've all been at school, we've been in classes, and a lot of times you get the theory, you get the book answers, so to speak. And what I wanted to do with that book, with Takeoff, was to take project management away from the theoretical and show project managers or project team members what's out there. What are some easy, quick ideas that I can use at home, at work, wherever, that will help my projects. And so basically that was the impetus behind that.
So I'm going to pop up another image I really like that I took from your book, the 4 Ps model. And we've got that up now for everybody to see. Plan, people, feedback, process. What was the genesis of that?
Yeah, Thank you. The idea comes from um, a theory. It's Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's an old TQM or Total Quality Management tool. And instead of the 4 Ps, you could put Plan, Do, Check, Act. What this is a model. This is just a starting point. A lot of times what you'll find, I found anyway, with leaders, teams, managers, all across industries, organizations, nonprofit, profit, government, military, is that we need a place to start. We need something to start us to think. And so here are just 4 reminders. In other words, if you're dealing with a project, and this can work with a problem-solving tool as well, first think about the people. Who is involved? Who are the people that are involved? We just talked about stakeholders. One of the things I want to mention is, in terms of your stakeholders, and I may be getting ahead of myself, but in terms of your stakeholders, think about your project. Who does the project touch, and who touches the project? And we kind of alluded to that with Shannon and Diane and David. So that was good. Or we really did more than allude to it. We talked about it. They talked about it. So, who does the project touch and who touches the project? So, that list could be really long when you first start it, but that's okay. It'll get smaller. And in terms of that, the stakeholders, and it deals with people here, not all stakeholders are created equal. That's a big point. Not all stakeholders are created equal. Some of your stakeholders are hugely important, and others, they're just in and out. Maybe one day or one afternoon, they come in, they give their expert opinion, their ideas or whatever, and they're gone for good. But that's okay. So you have to understand the people. If you don't get the people side of this, it'll all fail, because project management is all about people. The next one is process. Obviously, you need to have a process. We've been talking about that. We'll go more into that. We just don't want let that get run away to a point that all we're doing is paperwork and not solving the problem. Up in the other corner is plan. Obviously, we want to plan, think it through. That's the 3 words that I always tell project managers. 3 important words: think it through. And so we want to plan ahead. You do this at home, you do it at work, and so just do it with your project. The last one is feedback. I changed the F to a PH to make it the P's, and all that stuff. So you can deduct a point for spelling for me there, Professor Pennington. Sorry, but anyway, you have to have feedback, and we live in a world of systems. And the world is a system. Everything is a system. It's connected to other things, and so what we need to understand is, we need that. If you ever looked at models, you have an open and a closed system. This is a closed system where you have a feedback loop. And Richard and I will talk about that more in terms of our flying experience later on. So that's what that is. And basically you want to say, hey, did the project work? Did we succeed? Did we fail? How come we succeeded? How come we failed? That sort of thing.
I wanted to just, sorry. I wanted to interrupt one thing. To go back before I lose the thought. And Lisa Frank, who's on the call, that I think she's still on, you talked about priority stakeholders. One of the really good things about that global practice, when you look at it, all of you, is they brought up the idea of priorities of the stakeholders, that they're all not alike. So great insight. So sorry to interrupt you, Dan. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. That's fine. At the bottom in the yellow box, it's kind of difficult to see because of the color, but it's environmental forces. Environmental forces, the outside, like we were talking about in our group, the force majeure. Who would have ever thought in 2020 we'd have this thing called COVID-19 pandemic? Nobody. I mean, nobody saw this one come. Well, there might have been some people, but you had to be a soothsayer or a great fortune teller in Texas or California, or New York, or here in Hawaii to know that this was coming. You just didn't know. So environmental forces, all those things that are outside of our projects, and there could be tons of those, but you want to consider that. You'll see too on the sides that there are arrows, and those arrows basically mean that the process is a continually looping around process. In other words, you think about people, process, feedback, plan, and it just keeps on going. Now in the middle, again, because of the way the colors came out, one of the things that I always, and I'm not going to say it this way, but I always ask my classes, and I leave that blank, I'll say, who do you suppose is in the middle of this? Well, I'll give you the answer. Your customer. Who are you doing the project for? If you don't have this, this is a customer service model. It is a decision-making model. It's also a project management model to help get you thinking. But if we, with our project, do not have a customer, we do not have a project. We don't just go out and spend money and do all this work just for nothing. We do it for a reason, and usually, 99.9% of the time, we've got a customer. It could be all kinds of people. It could be more than one people, more than one person. It could be a number of people. So that's the 4Ps model as quickly as I possibly can.
Yeah, and I love the imagery. You know, when we spoke about this some time ago, I recall you bringing up Stephen Covey. Stephen Covey was the author. If any of you haven't read it, it's a great book. I forgot how many, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think.
Yeah.
And you brought up one of those. You remember which one that was? I'm curious.
Well, I like all of them, but with the project, and this is applicable, guys. This is applicable at work, for our projects at work. You guys are all project managers. We all are. And so whether it's at home, you're doing your basement, your attic, your backyard project, redoing a car, whatever, or at work, you got $1 million project going on. It's this: begin with the end in mind. And before you start anything, whether it's a big project or a little one, the whole project starts here. Begin with the end in mind. And so it begins with our mind, our mindset. What are we thinking? How do we see this project in our head? And the power of pictures, and I won't get into this because that's another lesson I use in other classes, but the power of pictures is very, very important with a project. And I really have to mention one thing, Richard. I'm going to go off on a tangent here. So here we go. When you create a project, folks, name it. Don't call it Project 1 or Project 22, or come up with a really cool name. Because the car makers in the world didn't just say, we have car makers or models 1, 2, 3, 4. They have names like the Chevrolet Impala, the Camaro, the Firebird from Pontiac. I'm an old Firebird owner, 2 of them. And, they have names, name familiarity, and, those sorts of things. But think about it as a picture in your mind. Then that'll make your project more achievable, possible, and probably successful as well.
Great. I'm going to pop up another slide now real quick. Very, very easy one. We, for you that, I think I mentioned this, Dan was a PMP professional or project management professional when I knew him, and he's since gone into leadership coaching and teaching leadership now. And he's been adapting to the environment. Love the fact that you brought up COVID, frankly. So I'm going to just put up a word here. And he and I actually came to this word first time. I'm just curious. Let's ask the group. Anybody know what Vuca means? Anybody ever heard this before? Raise your hands if you have. I'm just curious. And open your participant window. Look at the bottom. Well, now you're going to learn Vuca. So what's Vuca, Dan, and how's that important to what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I'm glad we brought this up. Folks, we live in a Vuca world right now. Our world is a Vuca world. This is a concept that came out of the Army War College many years ago. A friend of mine actually was one of the directors there that helped coin this phrase and these concepts. Vuca stands for 4 words: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Now, I think just about all of us would agree that that pretty well describes the world we live in today. You know, there are certain things that are going to stay the same. Like I told Richard a thing that I was told when I was a kid, upset one day. My dad said, well, you know, it's not that bad a deal. He said, if the sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west, then we're okay. But if that changes, if it comes up in the west and goes down the east, then we have something to worry about. We've got a big problem. So we aren't there yet, okay? But we do have a VUCA world. And if you stop and think about those 4 words, we have a volatile world. Our world is filled with uncertainty now more than ever. The complexities, think about just the technology. Who had been using Zoom 2 years ago? We knew about Skype or FaceTime, but we didn't, you know, that was only for the big time players. You know, they spend $1 million, you know, on their audiovisual needs and video conferencing. But look at this, anybody can use Zoom now. So complexity is an issue, and ambiguity is a huge issue. This is such a big problem, or a big issue. It's a problem, but it's a big issue that this next book that I'm writing deals significantly with this, and what we as leaders, and if you're a project leader, you're in this boat too, what we as leaders need to understand, but not only understand, we need to understand it and grasp these concepts and be able to deal with it. And so that book will be out later next year, but it's a VUCA world.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talked about with that was there's a book out now by Stanley McChrystal, a couple of books actually. He was a commander in Afghanistan, so he's grown up under the Army model a little bit. But there's the implications for this in project management and teams is that what you're finding, and you may all find this, and if you do, put it in the chat. I'm just curious. The idea of control has changed a lot now. We just can't control the way that we maybe are accustomed to when everybody's in the same office. So you're having to delegate to more. And the term that the Army uses is actually a term called commander's intent, meaning what we do as commanders is we try to frame out the overall purpose, as Dan has talked about, what the objectives are, but you've got to allow people within those guidelines to operate. And maybe some of you are finding that now, that, you know, when you're distributed, you're all working separately, you just can't control it all. You've got to let people move forward a little bit. It's called commander's intent. Now, the interesting thing on the question that we had, Dan, a little bit ago, I'm just turn this off a little bit, was about charters. You know, a charter is a great planning document along with the other planning documents that go with that. But if we're living in a VUCA world, we've got the requirement to adapt because the environment's changing all the time. Is there a need for charters anymore? I'm just curious what your thought is on charters. That was a great question that Diane, you know, brought up. Do you think charters are still needed?
Don't take my charter away, Richard. What it level sets for us more than anything is with our executives, with my city manager, my DCMs. That's really where it helps the most, because it forces their involvement from the beginning, because they're the first ones to say, and they are busy. They do have all sorts of other priorities. That's why they have directors, and that's why they have departments that handle this stuff. But that is a great for us from the beginning with our upper management.
In terms of the charter, I want to bring up a concept that I like to highlight with classes. The charter, it does a lot of things. It's like the Constitution of the United States. It gives us some kind of guidelines, some boundaries, some rules of the road, you know, those sorts of things, and kind of helps us define the project. But one of the things that the project charter does for us, and folks, please understand, the charter does not have to be this 20,000 page long document. It could be half a page, you know, it could be maybe a paragraph. It could be a very limited statement, but usually, you know, there's more to it than a couple paragraphs. And it depends on the size and the scope of the project. But one thing that I want to bring out, and Richard, I forgot to mention this before, one of the big things that you want a charter for is this. Your charter is a power transfer document. It transfers power. The charter basically is saying whoever signs the bottom of the charter, and that can vary. It depends. Like at Microsoft, not every charter is signed by Bill Gates or, the CEO, like back in the day with Bill Gates running the place. So not always do they get signed by the top of the heap. It's appropriate signage level, but you want a high powered person, high enough in the organization to sign off and say, okay, Dan Price is going to be doing this. Shannon's going to be doing that. Richard's doing that. And Matthew's doing this. And Tracy's doing that. And it's very specific as far as transferring power from that decision maker over to the people that are out there where the rubber meets the road. So the transfer of power is a very big thing.
So Diane, we didn't take it away, did we?
Thank you so much.
So great. Hey, let me just turn on the images here one more time, and we're gonna. I'm gonna just summarize this in terms of the discussion that I had with Dan about the triple constraints, because we're going to talk about this also in the context of contract management. But and you correct my work on this, Dan. But one of the things they teach project managers is there are three fundamental components to the relationships between the components of a project. One is the scope of what it's done. That sound familiar? I think it does to all of us. The second is the schedule. That sound familiar? I think it does. And the other is the budget and the monetary impacts. Well, did I get that pretty well close about the triple constraints?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I totally agree.
So,
yeah, scope, schedule, and budget. And it doesn't matter what we label them, and you're going to get into this later, but we could call scope something else, but that's the what part of the project. What do we do? Schedule is the timing, that's the calendar. Budget might be money, cost, something to do with money. Yeah. Good.
And as we'll show this slide again with price down on the bottom right hand side, that really is the contract management aspect of this in terms of what changes do to affect what you're doing. I wanted to end our conversation and open this up really for some more questions, but get Dan's thoughts on one other topic, and that is he and I had this discussion. Is there a point at which too much structure in this sort of, like your 20,000 page, I heard you say it, you don't have to have a 20,000 page project charter. So if you're doing an evaluation committee for a fairly small RFP with 3 evaluation committees, and you propose a 20,000 page word charter, is that structure going to do anything to impact the overall creativity or the innovation in the group? Your thoughts on that? I know we've had this discussion a couple times. I'm just curious your thoughts, Dan.
Yeah, I agree with the point that you're going to is we have to balance, as we show here in this slide, the structure that we need. We need to be able to track the project. We need to be able to track the dollars and cents, the hours and the minutes. What's getting done, what's needing to be done. We need to be able to track that. And so what I will do is I'll say to my students or to project managers, use some common sense. If we don't have to make it more complex, let's not just throw things out just to make the binder bigger, because, sometimes people think, well, my project binder is only this big when it should be this thick. More pages, more pieces of paper in there make my project more important, and I'm better and I'm more important. Well, did the project get done? And 2, was the project a success? And that's something we didn't talk about, and that's for another session perhaps. But we've got to be careful. And so you got to use your common sense. And one of the things I'll do is, I was thinking about this last night. A lot of times people will talk about, hey, we've got to get this piece of software, Microsoft Project, for example, and we've got to use this. Well, maybe we need it. But you know what? For most projects, the most complex tool that many of us need for the projects that many of us do are those little yellow sticky notes, the Post-it notes, the past, there you go, Shannon. Those kind of size things. That's the thing. Let's keep it simple, the old KISS principle. And so we do have to balance it. So we need a little bit of structure, but we need a little bit of room to move around, be creative, be innovative. And as long as we do that, and back to what we were saying earlier, Richard, with the commander's intent, as long as we finish the project on time, on budget, and we've met the scope requirement of the project, who's to say that we, did something incorrect?
And you know what? That's the other thing I got from Dan. As I was happy to see somebody actually put in a book that you can use sticky notes. I mean, it was, we get so caught up in sophisticated project management tools that sometimes we lose that. I've got a couple other topics here, but Dan and I, as we met yesterday, and just talked about this. I'm going to hold them off for a final slide at the end to get his insight in, and they have to do with a little bit on risk management and some of that. But as often happens, I get people behind on these things, and I make it go long. So let's move. I'm going to move to just a Q&A, which I think is the most important part of this. I'm going to turn off this and just find out from you all any questions for Dan. You've got him. Ask him. I'm just curious. You can raise your hands. We're small enough to shout out anything you'd like to do and to ask him. He's going to stick with us, and so we'll have Dan and some more insight about probably how he got to leadership out of project management a little bit, and something he called failure hours. So let me shut up. I see a body language by Shannon. Yeah. Shannon Lockwood. Direct my work now, Shannon. We doing pretty good from your perspective, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Huh?
I've been really interested. This is so relevant for me, and every time you guys have touched on something, I have a different way of phrasing it.
Yeah.
Most of the things that I've heard resonate somewhere in the meetings and event space. The design with the end in mind is a huge factor. That's the thing that all meetings and events start with. What are you doing? Why are we meeting? What's the point? And the question I have for Dan is, I saw the scope, schedule, budget triangle, and my previous life at Hargrove, the line was, you can have all of it, you can have it fast, or you can have it cheap, but you only get two. You don't get all three. So
Right.
Do you see that triangle as being able to be complete? Can you get all of the things? Can you complete the full piece of the scope and be in budget and stay on schedule? Because my experience has been you really only get the full expression of two of those things.
That's a great question, Shannon. The scope, schedule, and budget, triple constraints. You don't have a project unless you have those three things. You got to have scope, schedule, and budget. If one of those three things drops out, then you just don't have a project by the PMI definition, Project Management Institute. And when you think about it, common sense kind of says the same thing. Now, back to your question specifically, what you have normally is you'll have a situation where the boss walks in and says, I want you to do this, this, and this. You have this amount of time and this amount of money to do it, scope, schedule, and budget. Okay. And so you go out, you get your team, and you're all happy, and you got 20,000 people or 3 or 4 people or whatever, and you're chugging away doing your project. And it's a year-long project. And then and it's a year long, you got $1 million to do it with, and year long, and you're happy. And then 3 months into the project, the boss walks into your office or maybe your cubicle there and says, hey, Shannon, remember that project you were working on? We talked about, project, I'm going to use Mountaintop, because that's the mountaintop behind Richard. Project Mountaintop. Remember that was a year long, $1 million? Well, guess what? Things have changed. Uh-oh. Grab your purses and wallets, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. And the boss says, I want the same scope, but you have 3 months left to do it, and I have to take away $500,000 of that $1 million budget. What? That's change. So, yeah, to answer your question, we normally come up with the scope, schedule, and budget, and we plan and we go forward with that thought in mind. But then this nasty thing called change happens. Remember, we live in a Vuca world. We've got COVID virus, COVID-19 virus, all the kinds of things going on. So all of a sudden these changes happen. So when the change happens, what I tell project managers is, okay, I want to give that sponsor or a stakeholder, but sponsor the best project. So I can say, look, I can give you X, Y, and Z with that new budget and that new schedule, but I can't give you the full scope that you asked for, that we planned for, months ago. And so give them the decision. It's not your decision as the project manager to make those kind of decisions. It's that leader's decision-making process that he or she needs to go through. So they need to do the trade-offs. And folks, this is the big word for the day: trade-offs. Trade-offs. Project management is all about trade-offs. And this is a great question. Shannon brought this up. I didn't cue her and say, I'll give you $10 if you ask this question. She asked it completely independently. But this is the real bottom line and underpinning to project management. Ladies and gentlemen, it's called trade-offs. You have to understand, just like Shannon asked, if I take away this and take away that, what can I do? And that's exactly what we were talking about with commander's intent earlier on when Richard brought that up. And so, folks, this is going to happen in projects. In fact, I've been teaching project management for many, many years, and hundreds of students, maybe a couple thousand, I don't know. And one of the things I tell people is, you're going to have a project, you're going to be a project manager, team member. And I always ask, show me by show of hands, how many people have ever had a project and it's never changed? I have yet to have anybody say they've had a project, a real project, no kidding, a no kidding project, without some kind of change. Now, it may be big, it might be small, but there's always change. And so your question, Shannon, is really like an arrow to the heart of what goes on with project management. And so we have to be ready for those questions, those issues, change, and so on. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And great conversation. And that was one we hadn't planned, and I didn't pay her any money either, Dan. So that was cool. Great question. The nice thing about using this triple constraint model is it's well known, and it's a way to frame a discussion with senior people to make them understand that, you can't get it all. I mean, I know you want me to, but you can't get it all. This is what's known as a Gantt chart. It's a free version, and this was done some years ago, so I think there's better ones now, but it's a way of aligning what the steps are. This happens to be one I just created for the event I talked about when I was at the law firm. And it talks about review the state developments, new legislation, contact the purchasing director, who was going to be our keynoter, talk about panelists, and it sort of maps out for you graphically what needs to happen when, so you can figure out a little bit. And this doesn't actually show a critical path. Well, it does, because everything's on it. But the critical path are those events that have to be done in order to get to the end objective, which is time. And in this case, because we needed to do this by November, we had a limited budget to follow on the discussion, and couldn't really slip the schedule, but the scope might change because especially if we got a snowstorm. So, we had to think about those things. So what's the critical path? It's that one that goes through the project that needs to be done, that it's really the determining events to get to the final result. More sophisticated versions of this actually let you put in parallel things. So in Shannon's case, she's not only doing speakers, she's trying to figure out a venue, and she's trying, if they're face-to-face, and probably contracting with the company that's going to set up the virtual. So there's a lot of things going on at the same time, all of which might have a little slack time in them, or a little bit and I know when we as speakers had our instructions from Shannon about how to do our recordings, they adjusted some things for us. So there was a little slack time built in to some of these events, but the critical path is the one that really is the one that has to be done on time in order to get to your objective. And then the other thing is long lead items. I mean, you need to ask, what do we need to do now? You know, we needed to contact the state purchasing director to see if we could get it penciled in to see if that was going to happen. So think in those terms about when you start planning. Did we use a Gantt chart in the McKenna project? No. We also didn't use a charter because we had a team that was well developed. We had done this before. We had our team norms. We talked about it and we met. We didn't really need to. And my guess is on your evaluation teams, you may not maybe have a project charter. We did, as I recall, on our e-procurement system, because that involves so many people. But you know, on the routine things, you may not have charters, but you probably have emails, and you'll be able to, you know, trade notes in terms of what we need to do and when. And you might have meeting agenda minutes that serve the same sort of thing. But that's one tool. This is just one more chart that I've used in the past to remind you that checklists have a great role. They keep you from forgetting things. They help you form your questions for stakeholders. They help you decide who to invite. And in procurement planning, which is what part of that chapter is all about and what the activity I've given you with the Word documents is about, that's what that's all about. You may not use it all. That's why I gave it to you in Word, frankly. You may have other things that are better. You may come from jurisdictions that have all kinds of other requirements I've never heard of, but get used to using those kinds of checklists. That's all about planning. And as Dan is so wonderfully really put it in terms of Vuca, you know, we do the planning to be able to adapt. To adapt, you've got to actually keep up with the airplane. This is B-52 being air refueled by a tanker. Dan and I happened to meet when I was using some aviation metaphors, wow, 12 years ago, maybe, in Colorado Springs. Dan was an aircraft commander. So when you walk into an airliner and you know, and you turn to the right as you walk in and you see the crew there doing all their stuff with all their gauges, and but when you look in the cockpit, to the left is the captain. Dan was a captain. He had thousands of hours in the B-52. I was a co-pilot. I was like the first officer on the right-hand side. I was a baby pilot, and because I went to law school, they had too many pilots and they needed to get rid of some of us. So I went to law school and became an attorney. But we are now behind on the picture, a KC-135 tanker. Think this is a project management exercise? Man, it is. You've got to get to the tanker within a couple of minutes of each other. You've got a mission and a targeted date that the navigators are trying to get you not only back to to land, but when you're training on bombing, you're trying to get over targets at predetermined times. I think that's where we learned the term stay ahead of the airplane. Any thoughts on that, Dan? You were project manager and didn't even know it in those days.
Yeah, that's the thing. We're all project managers and we don't even realize it. And we want to stay ahead. You know, you stay ahead of your project. You do this at home. For most of you, unlike where I am right now, but for most of you right now, it's wintertime. It's snowing, or it will snow, or it has snowed. And you plan ahead. You think, oh, gee, I'm driving my car down the street. There's a big icy spot. Well, I should slow down before I hit that ice, or before I come to this intersection so that I can stop at the next coming red light. So you think ahead, you plan ahead. And so that's really what the point of all of what we're talking about here is, just to think ahead of the project. But use your team to do that. Ask questions, get their input as well, because that's one of the things as a project manager. Don't do it all alone. Don't do it all yourself. Get the other team, involve your customers, your stakeholders, your sponsors as well.
Great. And Tracy's brought up a great term that most executives know. People that you work for have heard the term scope creep. Scope creep. That is the thing on the third of the triangle that affects projects. And we're going to see that here in just a little bit more. In many ways, you all have identified this, but I'm going to race through because I'm trying to get to one more breakout before we go into our final slide. A couple other tools just to think about. I use the taskbar and Microsoft Outlook. I don't do Gantt charts on my personal stuff. If you ever go into your, most of you have Outlook on your computers, and it allows you to put up the subject and the task. I link in what my key things I need to do going forward, like find the location for training, get commitments from co-faculty. These were things that we did. And I put those down on the bottom. And as I mark them off at the top, I move them up. So I've always got a task list that matches to my tasks, so I can see what needs to be happening. And I bet Shannon's got 16,000 of these going at any one time. But this is a way to use a tool fairly simply to move up your next tasks. So you've always got a task list going with what you're doing in terms of the going forward events that need, or tasks that need to happen. Communication. This is an example from my successful failure. I had an e-procurement 18 years ago that there's a lot of reasons for that. But the one thing that people really liked about what I was doing was the governor's office that had launched our successful failure, and the other department chairs that had people on my 24 team evaluation committee largely developed so that we could manage the change, to be honest with you, because people didn't understand why they needed to use this. They were happy using now Amazon.com or whatever. We were trying to aggregate spend so we could do some planning, and in terms of what we were spending in the state. People didn't get it. So I had to let everybody know. And we used a one-page update, and people loved it. It gave the schedule status of where we were, planned and actual. It gave the look ahead schedule in terms of what was coming up for the next 60 days or maybe 30 days. So people, and so nobody could say to me, and it's kind of like what Dan said, it's power shift. So I could actually say, well, that's why I send these out, so that your people are going to be busy at certain stages here. And even more so, it lets them take a schedule to a senior executive and say, hey, boss, just so you know, I know this other project's coming up. Here's what we got going on e-procurement. So last week's high points, celebrate the successes, what the issues were that we needed help with. We were working and we were marketing this. We needed to get people to use it, and we were going out to suppliers. So come up with a good technique for communicating upwards. I love this. This is Diane's. Upwards, sideways, and downwards. And notice scope issues. That's part of the project. If we're encountering those, we used to have a saying in the military, don't be the highest person in the chain of command with a secret. You wanted other people to be aware of these types of things that were going on. So plan your communications. A little bit on risk management. Probably don't have time to get into this in a lot of detail, but I didn't write this, but if you look forward a little bit in the book, you'll see a chapter on risk and change management in chapter 8. This would have been, had we used a 4-quadrant analysis, our assessment of what the risks were to the program. We were in Denver, Colorado, having this in December. High snowstorms were a likelihood pretty high, and impact could be pretty high. Internet loss, yeah, we could lose that. In the hotel, we didn't control that. Decent chance of that, but we could get around that. We passed out hard copy stuff if we lost internets, and we used we had a link in to a conference call capability audio for a speaker that was out that we needed to have. I'm sure, and Shannon has, I'm sure, a lot of more sophisticated things on a virtual, but this gives you an idea, because this is a knowledge area in project management. We're going to talk about that in a couple months in a little bit more detail, but this I'll let you know. If we had a venue fire, obviously catastrophic impact, low likelihood, but you know, you need to have some planning mechanism to deal with
And
risks
Richard,
to a project. Go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, Richard, just real quick, this tool, this 4-quadrant tool, sometimes they go to 9, but 4 is fine. This is a tool that a lot of your bosses use if they've been through the Harvard MBA program, or whatever MBAs they have. This is something that we introduce to them, and in the master, well, at the bachelor's level too. But this is a master's MBA kind of tool. And so this is kind of a piece of language that decision makers and leaders can understand. So this is one of those great tools for you as a project manager to have in your toolbox.
Like scope creep and like triple constraints. I would put those in that category too.
Yeah.
Also.
Yes.
This is the other slide. We addressed this on, when you're in the actual project now, and you're at the point where you've got a contract, which often serves as your charter in some ways at that point. There's going to be a relationship between schedule adjustments, what the scope adjustments are, and price. And your suppliers know this. And it's just like a project has these implications. But when you assign a contract, it's the same thing. I mean, Shannon can go to somebody and say, listen, we just ended up with, 6 more possible speakers. We need this. And can we build out, additional rooms? Sure. But there's going to be a cost. I mean, and it could be there's going to be a schedule impact. You hope not. So these are the things that that are related really to the whole idea of project management and our profession and what we do as procurement professionals. One of the other things, and we'll also talk about this in week 9, and that is team learning. One thing we don't do enough in our profession, I think, and some of you may do this very well, but is what I call after action reviews, lessons learned meetings, something after you finish a project to capture it. This was a project that I tell in the book, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. It was out of Port St. Lucie in Florida. They were trying to spend a lot of money on, it's been a decade now after the first economic down, or the big one, 2008. They got a lot of funding for neighborhood stabilization because there were a lot of businesses going out of business. This sound familiar? A lot of businesses going out of business, and they had a lot of foreclosures. This sound familiar? And they got some grants though. There was a block grant that went down, and they went in with this, and the story that's in the book has a lot of components with it. The one I wanted to talk about is what they learned. They went in for phase 1, and they had these great ideas, and they got a bunch of homes renovated that they actually bought and then sold to try to turn them around and make the neighborhoods nicer. And when they went to phase 2 for the next 100 homes, the suppliers didn't show up. And they went back and they said, well, that's not what we thought, because this was really innovative. I mean, we were using procurement cards for advances. We were waiving a lot of the requirements. We were cutting down. We had a innovative way to contract to get these people on fast and get them into these homes and do some renovations on the foreclosed homes. And we didn't think people didn't want to come. I mean, on the phase 2, what happened? And that's what actually happened, is nobody showed up and expressed any interest. They assembled a team to go and ask industry, the suppliers in the local community, why is this happening? And what they learned was that the way the requirements were written, it allowed people to come in and low bid and then get well on changes, is what the term is in construction. And there wasn't a real a lot of common authority for them to really make these homes livable, which is what a lot of the construction companies that dealt in these trades, they thought they'd go in and just make these nice so that people would want to buy them. And they turned around their approach, brought in building inspectors that really got into homes a lot and had them write the requirements differently. And then they actually had pre-bid meetings or pre-task order meetings, because they only gave them about a week or 2 to put together quotes. And they'd go to the properties and let them see it. And they got a lot of success and were able to spend the money. But they did that by taking the opportunity at a key milestone to to look at this stuff and to figure out what they do. Use that. The final thing before we're going to wrap this up with a breakout and then a final discussion with Dan is, this is all about collaboration. I mean, we did that in a breakout. I think you've got an indication of that now. You know, projects require stakeholder collaboration, and sometimes you need to bring in people outside your own little world, because they're the ones that actually can see when things may not be working just the right way. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, a great book. This is a quote. It really reinforces the idea of collaboration. This is our e-procurement project. I gave it to you this morning. It's going to be shorter. Let me share the screen. We'll let you peek at it again. This is the rest of the story. This is one of those projects that never really happened the way you expected. We got a new strain of pandemic right in the middle of this whole thing. Programmers aren't available. They're staying home. Silicon Valley is a problem. Even some of the educational supplies, the things like whiteboards and the things that might have been ordered off of this, if it was going to be done inside, is changing. The contractor who's on contract sent you a notice of change under the provisions and the force majeure clause that, wow, even Dan knows that word, right? Force majeure. So they've sent you that. They can't do this, they don't think. What actions do you need to do to talk about now? You're on contract. You're trying to get this done by the beginning of the school year. You got a contract. You got suppliers probably lined up. What do you need to do as a project team? I think we got everybody back. Shannon's group, I don't know if you'd pick somebody else to be spokesperson. You already had some insights. Anybody from that group want to just give me one thing maybe that was a surprise or an insight perhaps you didn't think about? Anything?
Right, is to bring the legal department to the equation.
Yeah, Majed. And, you know, that ties right in with what Dan was talking about in terms of priority. You're not going to have them involved on the, maybe in the planning phase up front, if you've got some unusual issues with terms and conditions and intellectual property and open records and some of that. But usually during the evaluation phase, they're not going to be members of the committee unless a problem comes up. But they're probably going to get elevated in priority in a dispute like this. I mean, trying to figure out, once they figure out what the force majeure clause is, decisions are going to happen here. And we're going to talk about this in the lab on the 7th lab about the process analysis and decision making. But just to give you and this is in the book. So the nice thing about having the book is there's a lot of places in there to go to read stories and see. And I talk about my successful failure in there. But, you know, a decision's a process. You frame the question. You collect and organize relevant information. You try to figure out what you're trying to achieve, what the options are. You know, one of the options here that you wouldn't probably make a decision on, but the school may want to, would be, do we just suspend this whole thing and just focus on the virtual learning, which is going to be, we can deal with the things inside the school, you know, with our current equipment. But, you know, if we've got to do virtual learning, prepare to be wrong. That's the options issue. I mean, what if we are wrong? How do we go forward? And then decide, implement, and that's going to be probably another project. You know, Dan had mentioned that sometimes these spawn additional projects with different stakeholders in different teams, and learn from that, as I mentioned. So take a look at that chapter. This is the chapter 10. What my summary is, and I'm no expert on this stuff, but if I had to tell people the 5 things to model your behavior to be a leader on a team, is helping, just helping. And project management is something teams can use help with. Use enough structure to help organize thinking and action. This is what the new PMBOK is going to have due out for this fall, but it reputedly is going to be delayed a year or two. And it's really gone into a principles-based approach, almost like Commander's intent, of defining principles for project management to allow you to adapt to the Vuca world. And I asked Dan, well, let me just open this up. I asked Dan, for one thing, how he made his journey into more on the leadership side rather than the process side. But I'd like to hear your questions as you read these things about principles of project management. Do you have any? questions that you want to ask? And if not, I'll ask Dan to tell us about why the leadership piece has occupied his time.
Yeah, just a real quick housekeeping. PMBOK stands for Project Management Body of Knowledge. It's like the Bible of project management. It defines all the terms and all that stuff, you know. So it's kind of like the source document for all of project management from PMI, Project Management Institute.
And they sell that. They sell that. You can buy that. Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
And what they're doing is PMI is going through modification. They're trying to be adaptive. And what they're finding out is that we need to be more systematic, systems thinking. If you look over the left-hand column, value, we have to understand the total value and its cost, you know, cost of ownership, things like that. Cost of obtaining a customer is, you know, things like that. There's just a lot of things that just didn't play into it back years ago when PMI started out in the late 60s. Holistic thinking, leadership, they're really moving heavily towards leadership. Leadership is a big deal. And it's not just managing a project, because as a project manager, you're a leader because you have a team of people on most projects. There may be a project where you're the leader and the team, you know, one person team, but that doesn't happen too often for most of us. So you have to deal with.
And let me just interrupt, Dan, real quick, and then I'm going to have you finish your thoughts. So we're almost at the top of the hour. The takeaway from this is, if you've got people that you're working with that are trained in project management, have a Zoom or take them to lunch and talk about their expectations and how they view the world on this stuff, like value and cost. So that would be my takeaway from this slide. But I wanted Dan to have a chance, and you're welcome to stick, and I'm not going to be offended if you leave. Got it? But Dan, if you can finish your thoughts on that slide, I appreciate it.
Sure. And one of the things over in the right-hand column is they were talking about opportunities and threats, you know, the yin and yang, the complexity, it just kind of fits with what's going on with the Vuca world. And then the last two, adaptability, resilience, and change management, same thing. So everything, you know, it's almost like serendipity, you know, they've been thinking about this for a long time, and now we have COVID-19. And so it kind of really dovetails nicely into what's happening in the world. So hopefully this will come to pass. Over to you, Richard.
And yeah, on the Agile thing, go ahead. Any other questions that prompted? I'm just curious. The Agile development thing is something I've been studying and reading about, and they are taking a rather iterative approach to price. They'll start out with prices. They use a different glossary of terms in some of the software development approaches, things like user stories and sprints, and things that are moving quickly and adjusting what they call an indicative fixed price at various times during the project, and then moving back and looking at their scope kind of portfolio and making trade-offs, which is what Dan had talked about. Of course, all that impacts price. And so it's going to force, I think, our professionals to be embedded a little bit closer to what's happening on the project management side as some of these contract things are done by companies using those approaches. So who did we make mad? Who
Richard?
did we, yeah, jump in. Yeah.
We our group works in out of PMBOK. PMBOK is the methodology that is the foundation, but it's not the only methodology we use, and we don't use all of it because it's huge, right? There's a lot that would just bog us down, but the impacts of what y'all are talking about, it really goes, especially for those like me who've been around. I've been doing this for 30 some years now. Some of it, when you first hear it, people are saying that flies in the face of good procurement and stewardship of your entity's money. So, because we get stuck in, some people I know still struggle with best value. And how long has that been around? You know, really
I lost you there a little bit.
I still have to do anything else, but so this whole Agile and not having that solid contract price, yet price is part of determining who gets the award, the chicken or the egg, it's causing some heartburn for some procurement folks. So we work through that, but Some on my team, it's just, well, we have no idea if what we're spending and if we're spending our money wisely or right. And I said, well, that's what we need to know. We need to not get so afraid that we paralyze ourselves for making a good decision on a product. But some of this agile and scope change, because what do we learn all the time? You don't want change orders. You want to know what you're going in with, and you want to know what you're going to come out with. So
which, Diane, what the problem with that is on what they call waterfall implementations, the ones we've done for years, the Big Bang is
they're not a good
they're
way.
terrible. Yeah,
It's
and they estimate, I think 85% of projects never achieve expectations in terms
Absolutely.
of one
If
of
you
those
look at the Gartner report on project failure for
I lost
said
you
on the
there. We're
waterfall, by
having
the
some
time-
internet
sometimes by the time we
connectivity.
get through the procurement process and award, that it's changed a couple of iterations from what they proposed to you. Sometimes between what they proposed and when they present, it's a different product. So the agile is what we're moving towards. But it's a challenge from the traditional procurement thought process.
Well, the IT perspective on this sometimes is, I know you guys are interested in price. We're trying to keep up with industry. We're trying to keep up with technology, and you're not responsive enough to us in terms of, we can't wait 18 months at a fixed price, because by then all the requirements have changed. We've got to be more agile is the word. So, but great insight. By the way, I will probably send out with the project management example I've got, which is a simple one. I'll probably let people know, Diane, that you actually have a project management office under you. So
Sure,
that's unusual.
I did. If anybody else does, I haven't found anybody yet. I feel like
that's a terrific thing to know. Yeah. So
yeah, it's been, they've really changed the makeup of our department in the last few years, and that was one of the big ones.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, thanks again, Dan, for hanging in there. I learned something from you every time we talk, and I appreciate you giving us your time and great insight. And I've learned lots already. So I hope maybe some of you can join us at one of our other labs if you can join us, and we'll keep learning. That's what it's all about. Keep learning. Thanks, everybody.